You are listening to the 4-Phase Cycle Podcast with your hosts, Megan and Alex of Zesty Ginger. If you're looking to naturally balance hormones and learn how to work with your body instead of against it, you have come to the right place. As a duo of an integrative MD and a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, we use the 4 phases of the feminine cycle in combination with functional lab work to transform the lives of the women we work with. Just a quick reminder though, this information is not intended to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. Always consult with your own doctor before making changes. Ready to take control of your health? Let's get started.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Alex here, and guess what time it is? It is Podclass time again. So I have decided, we decided, that it was time to bring back a series of podclasses. And if you have no idea, if you're new here and you have no idea what I'm talking about, Season 1 is a series of 24 podclasses where I did kind of start to finish of the female cycle. If you haven't listened, I highly suggest starting there. However, this series of podclasses is going to be about reading Dutch test results and the story that they tell. So even if you don't have Dutch test results, you will still get a lot out of the conversations that we'll be having here. However, if you do have them, then it's, even more advantageous to you, because this is basically going to be a breakdown of some of the things I think about when I am reading results like this. So if you don't know what Dutch is, dried urine test for comprehensive hormones is what Dutch actually stands for. It is a functional test, like the name suggests. It's a urine test that you do on day 19 to 22 of your cycle. Or, ideally we're tracking ovulation and doing 5 to 7 days after that. So it's a test that you do at home. You just you basically pee on filter strips at home at certain intervals throughout a 24-hour period. And then it gives you a readout of your sex hormone status at this part of the cycle. And if you don't have one, or if you have a wonky one, there's obviously a whole procedure for that. But I'm just doing an overview of why someone would even want to do a Dutch test and why I'm talking so much about it. And so I like the fact that it's done at home and that you can, order it and send it back, and it's much more comfortable than the usual lab runaround. But then it gives you sex hormones for that period, and then adrenal hormones, so cortisol state, melatonin. It gives you so much information about, we're going to talk about, the hypothalamic system and how the central nervous system feeds into the healthy hormone state. And then this is also going to give us information on our adrenal reserves, cortisol management, cellular reactivity and response, our energy maintenance throughout the day, kind of what's happening while we sleep or while we not sleep. So all of this sort of information is what makes tests like this in the functional world so useful, and why so many of us, like me, conventional MDs, are also coming to the functional world and saying, this is really great information that, lab work that just looks at end organ failure or not is a completely different look into how someone works when we're looking at actual functionality of organ systems. And that's why tests like this are so amazing. So that's our spiel on functional medicine. And of course, we believe that functional medicine, is best merged with conventional medicine, because that's what Megan and I are the duo that we are, because we have that belief that we love the stuff from both sides, and there's true power in it. And so really what you'll hear from me is where I've kind of merged what I learned in medical school residency and pathophysiology and all of that, merged with what our experience in the functional world and how I think that ties in. So this is where I hope to bring you guys a really cool look at how we think about hormones and what makes our little duo unique at looking at this, because we bring such a wide spectrum of interpretation to this. So that is what my goal is for this series of pod classes. And so I'm going to dive in today to talk about the hypothalamus and its role of communicating with the ovaries and what that actually looks like in terms of ovulation and not. All right, so with all that whole intro, now we're going to get into the really good stuff. And I'm basically, the format that I'm following is that I'm going to use the dials on the Dutch test to go through all the main organ systems associated with all of these hormones and basically what they're telling us. So we'll be talking about, how does the setup even happen for things like high estrogen or low progesterone or high testosterone or low cortisol, all these things that you may have heard, but they have stories and backstories that are associated with them, that when we know that, all of this knowledge can help us cut through the clutter of information that's out there, because then we can get really specific and logical, and paired with information that you gather about yourself, you can really take this to a whole new level of understanding how your own body works, which is the reason for empowerment that we really believe in. So Megan and I, we always talk about education leads to empowerment, which leads to enjoyment, right? That's our model for how we want to take you through everything. And our end game is to take that knowledge, empower you to take action towards it, and live a life that you're really excited about and feeling good in. And so all of that will come together in this series, and that is my intention for you. So now, with that said, let's jump back to the conversation of how we even get estrogen and progesterone made in our bodies. So for anyone who got their period to basically the time you go into menopause, this is happening. And basically all the wonkiness that happens with hormones is found in some sort of step in this communication that I'm going to talk about. So things like perimenopause and things like, when I had premature ovarian failure at 27, which thank God I don't have anymore, but basically what all of that happens with fluctuations in the story that I'm about to tell you. So there is real power in understanding how this stuff works, because like I always say, when I'm a Dutch consultant, so when I'm on the phone with practitioners, I'm by the way not with this podcast is in no way affiliated with actual Dutch, like we're not. But when I do the consults, when I tell this story, practitioners are like, oh my gosh, it actually makes all the women make sense, because once we lay out a plan for somebody, it's really our goal is that plan would be in place and work for them for 5 to 10 years. We want a plan that's so responsive to someone that over the next, we're predicting a lot of these cycle shifts happen in a predictable sort of way over someone's lifetime. And yes, individually we shift all over the place. However, when we know the standard cycle, then when we interpret the story that really is just two main dials that we're going to look at on the first page, if you have one, there's estradiol, which is going to be the marker for the main estrogen here on this, which is why it's the summary page. So estradiol and then progesterone. So really the first two things that we look at when we are looking at a summary, and no matter what it is, whether it's blood or whatever you're looking at, when you're looking at that sort of snapshot here, the estrogen and progesterone levels really tell a whole story. So it goes like this. The brain, a special part called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells the ovaries to make a certain amount of estrogen at any given point in the cycle, right? So that's how we get the curve for estrogen. So early on in the cycle, at first, while you're having your period, there's a few days of, things are low, which is why people get baseline blood levels on day 3, which hopefully that clears some questions up for you if you've ever had to do that. So then the signaling begins to happen. So from the brain to the ovaries, an estrogen starts to get made. Then that estrogen goes on to communicate to the eggs, the follicles inside the ovaries, to develop. And one of them ultimately wins. It basically works like one of them gets stronger than all the others and says shush to all the other follicles and the other eggs, and they kind of just stay back, and that follicle grows as much as the estrogen and the body tells it to do so. So that's how when we get the snapshot with the DUSH, we actually, even though we're the estrogen at that point in the second half of the cycle, like I said, day 19 to 22, can be whatever it is at that moment. Like a lot of people are high with estrogen dominance, but depending on what the progesterone did, we can actually backtrack what happened with the cycling earlier on in the cycle, which is super cool, right? So we have that story. So early on, the estrogen's telling the follicle to develop. Then that follicle gets nice and big, or however, it develops. And normally it would grow to a moderate size. That egg would get ovulated halfway through the cycle. And then what happens to the follicle that housed the egg to begin with, just floating around in this like little soup, and the cells around it take care of it. And once it gets released, then that follicle inside the egg that had fluid inside in the egg, which, by the way, sometimes that's what some of you are feeling when the fluid ruptures and irritates the lining of your inside, then the peritoneal lining it's called, then you feel a little bit of that pain. So if you feel ovulation, like Megan says she feels a pinch, sometimes that can be because of that little bit of fluid or a lot of fluid, depending on how big that follicle got, which, by the way, that dysregulated process can lead to ovarian cyst. So you could see how that's all related to this going on too. But anyway, so halfway through the cycle, the egg leaves, that follicle releases its little bit of fluid. It's actually a little tiny bit. That's how sensitive the lining is. And then that follicle collapses, gets turned into what's known as the corpus luteum. You don't have to remember that, just for those of you who care. And that structure, depending on how big that follicle got, determines of how big that corpus luteum is, which determines how much progesterone we end up having around, because that corpus luteum is the only structure in a non-pregnant female that secretes progesterone, which is why we always say no ovulation equals no progesterone. And of course, low progesterone means, little follicle got made, small corpus luteum. So that's how it all ends up tying together. Now, there are all sorts of patterns that can happen where someone can have really high estrogen, too much of it, and so it overshoots and a follicle does not get made at all. So, for example, mine in residency was that this was when my ovarian function was recovering post IVF and all the stuff that we were doing, and I was basically going through healthy hormones on my own, with Megan, and she was helping me, and so as I was recovering, then we did a follow-up one, and I was estrogen dominant at that point, which is a really common stepping stone until the progesterone catches up. But so at that point, I had totally overshot my estrogen and made zilch as far as a follicle. So I was not ovulating, super estrogen dominant. So it's basically going unopposed. On the other hand, when my first one went back when, pre-IVF, I had really low estrogen, so my hypothalamus did not signal to my ovaries at all. I was super, depleted at that point anyways. And so my hypothalamus registered that and said, now's not the time for baby, and shut that down, right? So I already had issues because of endometriosis, but the stress of things certainly was not helping, and I could see that with the test. And so everything was low, so there was just no signaling happening at all. And so there's all sorts of orientations where the relationship between these two can fall. So for example, some people really overshoot their estrogen, so the signal is to make a lot of estrogen, but then they make a really big follicle, and so they have a lot of progesterone as well. And so sometimes it looks like that on tests, right? So it can fall out a number of ways, but then it's important to overlap a normal cycle with your actual results and then backtrack logically to see what happened. So that's where, working with your provider is really important to sleuth. We're basically, Megan and I joke that we're always doing detective work because, we're only seeing snapshots, but those snapshots, given the framework that we know, give us a ton of information about what's happening. So I hope you guys found that super helpful. I hope that gave you a little taste of what I'm going to be talking about. There's, of course, going to be a lot more of these, a lot more to talk about, but that is a really big portion of this equation, and I want you, there's a lot to think of here and a lot to wrap your mind around. So, we have a bunch of posts on Instagram. We're zesty_ginger over there, and we have a bunch of posts, and on our feed I had made all these little visuals and drawings of what actually is happening. So if you are more of a visual learner, for sure go check those out so that you can look at them side by side, and then in listening, maybe you'll listen again. Just start to digest this, because we're going to build on all of this. That's why I'm going to try to keep these a little bit on the shorter side, because there's a lot to digest, but I promise you, all this stuff is going to start feeding back into each other, and is going to start making a whole lot more sense. So I'm so excited for you guys to come on this journey with me, and I will catch you next time. In the meantime, please go leave us a review on iTunes. It super helps us, so we really, really appreciate it. It helps us reach more women, and that's really our goal, to improve the lives of as many women as possible. So if you guys could help us with that, we would so appreciate it. And then the other thing is, for sure, just even if you don't come for the visuals, come say hi to us on Instagram, because that's where we hang out mostly, and we would love to hear from you. All right, have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for